Hi, my name is Nikki from Permaculture Gardens at growmyownfood.com, and today I wanted to talk about spring garden maintenance. Spring garden maintenance begins with the following: garden installation or clearing of your raised beds, cultivating your plants, taking pest prevention measures, and maintaining your plant and soil health throughout the season. But let's dive a little deeper into each one of these topics. A common question folks ask us is, when do I start preparing for my spring garden? And the answer is 3 months before, the season before. We typically start implementing spring garden maintenance around January in the midst of winter. And if you haven't yet done so, clear away the debris from any overgrown garden beds that you still have left from the fall or from the summer, and prune trees and shrubs during the late winter season when the perennials are still dormant. And now, and January, February, March is also a good time to install any new garden beds you may have in mind. Now, if you're already watching this and you're in the middle of spring, you can still implement these things in preparation for your summer garden. And here's one way that we encourage garden installation: by creating a weed-free lasagna garden. There's a link below this video on how to install a lasagna garden and what that means. For us, it means a weed-free raised bed. Now, the second point the second tip for maintaining spring gardens is to keep on cultivating your plants. Keep on starting those seeds if you haven't done so already. We would start spring seeds 3 months, 2 to 3 months before indoors, but we'd start our summer seeds in the middle of spring. So starting many of our beloved warm weather crop seeds happens in the spring season. In February, we start tomatoes and peppers in USDA growing zone 7. Peppers first. Tomatoes can wait a little till the end of February. But we'll start perennial flowers around February. Right now we have beets going, which are early spring crops or late spring crops. We always have lettuce growing year round. Transplanting these seedlings into the ground happens during the early spring months, when the ground is starting to warm up in the Northern Hemisphere. You can learn more about how we start our plants from seed and how we transplant them in 2 blogs that I'll link to below this video as well. Third thing, pest prevention. The onslaught of summer, you're deep into the pests if you haven't taken pest prevention measures as early as before the spring or during the spring. So one of the best ways to prevent pests from attacking your crop is to try to avoid them in the first place. So here are a few pointers for doing pest prevention as part of a spring garden maintenance routine. First, confuse your pests. Plant or intercrop aromatic plants alongside the crops that you intend to grow for eating. So for instance, if you're growing a bed of brassicas, a bed of kale, you want to confuse the pests by intercropping garlic in there. Or if you're growing a bed of tomatoes for the summer, you want to, in the spring, already put those marigolds inside in between those tomatoes so as to confuse the pests, to attract the pollinators, and to deter pests such as nematodes even. So it depends. Marigolds are really good. We have more about cropping and intercropping in a blog that's linked below as well. So there's a lot of subtopics in this spring garden maintenance video. Here is another example. You can grow plants that pests don't like, as in the case of itchy borage or prickly pear or cinquefoil, to ward off deer. In addition, you can rotate your crops so that pests that have overwintered in a certain location, and remember that place as being the place that they feasted on a particular crop, they can get confused and expect that crop there and not have it. So if you've planted tomatoes in one place last year, you might want to swap that out for something else. This is especially true of all the cucurbit plants. So anything that's a squash, a zucchini, a cucumber, a melon, um, those guys, a pumpkin, they get the bulk of the bugs in the northern, at least in the US, where you get a lot of squash bugs and all sorts of disease. So you want that place that they were in to change this year. The second is put a row cover on crops early in the spring that are susceptible to things like white flies and aphids. So that way these, or the cabbage moths, that way these cabbage moths do not land on the crops and lay their eggs in them. And yet they can be, and yet they can serve as a protection against these bugs, but they can also let the light in. So you want that row cover to be breathable, especially earlier in the spring when things are warming up. During the winter time, you still want to protect, if you do have crops growing in the ground, you do want to protect them from the cold. And so we have plastic row covers on top of the breathable row covers, and more on low tunnels and row covers in a different blog. You can check out our wintering blogs on that topic. The third for pest prevention is keeping your soil watered well, to make sure that the plants are still getting that moisture that they need, and yet not keeping it so soggy. So you're watering it to the point that it's damp, but that your bed is not soggy, because the sogginess, pooling of water will attract or make the soil favorable for the rise of anaerobic bacteria, which is what we don't want in your garden. Fourth, trellis your crops, especially early spring crops like peas and later summer crops, the things that'll grow up a trellis. You want to trellis whatever you can trellis. Anything that's vining, you want to trellis and keep away from the ground. Where there are pests such as slugs, or and also to keep that moisture, again, we want to deter fungi that are harmful. So you want to keep it as dry as possible near the root zone. Fifth, for root crops and crops low to the ground, make sure that you have appropriate fencing to guard against burrowing pests such as rodents, rabbits, groundhogs. So sometimes we think of the fencing when we do our garden installations above, right, against the deer, against the rabbits. But the rabbits will sometimes burrow, and you want to make sure that if you do have this, and if you don't need it, if you're in your backyard, it's suburban or urban enough that you don't have the burrowing pests, then you might not need to fence all the way 12 inches into the ground. But in our case, we do. So we have voles, and we need to find fencing that goes this way, like underneath, and not just above. And if you have a hungry bird population, you'd want to net things like blueberries or berries that are, we had our earliest berries in our backyard used to be gummy berries. They're wonderful. Now there's so much of them that we didn't need to net them because we just shared, and that's okay too. If you don't need to net them, the less work for you, the better. But if this is your prize blueberry, the first year you're growing a blueberry or pawpaw, for instance, and they're being attacked, I've never had my pawpaw attacked, but if you've had a crop that's being attacked and it's something that you really prize, you might want to put some netting on it. And you can repurpose things like the netting bag that your onions come in and your lemons come in. You can use those. I've used those, and they've been very, very helpful. You can learn more about encouraging natural allies in the organic garden as it deals with pests and such on the link below. So there are lots or on the blog that's attached to this video. Create fertile and healthy soil so that plants become more resilient to pests and disease. And that is the fourth tip for spring crop maintenance, and that's maintaining your plant and soil health. So how do we do that? Plant and soil health are a crucial part of spring garden maintenance, And yet, this area is often overlooked. We think about starting our seeds, we think about making the raised beds. We don't think about maintaining what's currently there often. So here are a few parts of that holistic health program that you can implement for your crops and your soil. First is have a soil test. A soil test is really important, especially as a baseline. If you're starting a garden for the first time, you want to have a soil test first to know what you're starting with, what your parent material is. You may be starting, you may have just moved, and especially if you've moved and you're not familiar with the terrain, the minerals and the nutrients in that first garden are a question mark. So you're not sure what you're missing in terms of nutrients. Now, you don't have to soil test every month or every year, even. You can soil test once, and then from there, um, amend your soil according to what you need. And there's a large, long soil amendment list below this video that I'm not going to go through in detail because it really depends on what your soil test tells you. And then it'll depend on what your plants tell you. And your plants themselves, when you see them diseased or really prone to bugs or infestations, that's a key that it's not just your plant struggling. Your plant is struggling to make the environment favorable in your soil, but it needs more help from you. So you need to start that before it starts growing well. It's going to start making sure that its environment is really good. And then you'll see that in the vibrant growth that you'll see from your plant. And that's a bio indicator. Then you have a bio indicator in the plants themselves and in the soil and the soil quality that you can perceive through your eye. But they're the things that we don't perceive through our eye, and that's the mineral nutrient profile and the biology, which is the what insects and microbes and bacteria and archaea and fungi are there in your soil. More on that in another blog that I haven't written yet. So soil amendments, soil test, and then crop rotation. We talked a little bit about how you shouldn't plant the same thing if that plant is prone to bugs and disease. Same thing in that place, that is. Rotating your crops helps promote healthy soil, yes, because it rejuvenates. If you, depending on what you put into that soil, the next season you can rejuvenate it and you can give it back life. And so more on this topic, to regenerate the soil using crop rotation and intercropping in the blog link below. We are indebted. I just wanted to throw a shout out to Amy Strauss, our friend, who is the author of the Suburban Microfarm book, for the minerals that are listed on this blog. There are more that she goes into in her book, the Suburban Microfarm. And with that, I hope that this and the checklist that you can get at the bottom of this blog will be helpful in preparing your own spring garden. We're so excited to see your gardens grow as we are ours. So keep in touch and send us photos, and we'll talk soon.